All right, welcome back. So now we're going to talk about the ends means ethic. Okay. Now, originally we think this might have come from ancient Rome, but it's generally attributed to Machiavelli. I forgot to check off the doctor of the name. Okay. Ends means ethic. Okay. This is generally attributed to Machiavelli. I don't know if it's still the case. I know when I was a freshman in high school, we all had to read The Prince for our world history class. And one of the things that he talked about, it was better to be feared than loved. Okay, that was how you solidified power. Okay, and so the ends means ethic basically says the ends justify the means. You can do anything you wish as long as you get to that basic endpoint. And now here's the problem with that. Sometimes the ends, sometimes the means are actually more important or just as important as the ends themselves. And again, I'm not sure that character is truly developed when you don't really pay attention to the means. Sometimes the process to get to the end point is just as important as the end point itself. So let me give a couple of examples. Thinking about in this course, corporate social responsibility, right? Shareholders, of course, want value at the end of the day. But if a company is doing horrible things in the process to get, those extra few cents per share, are the shareholders going to approve of that, appreciate that, or not? Okay. Thinking about cheating on a test. Well, yeah, you got 100, but did you actually learn the material in the process? Okay. And again, the big thing that you want to look at, especially in some of the cases that we'll talk about in this class, yes, in the short run, not paying attention to the ends, not paying attention to the means may be a good short-term strategy, but in the long run, it typically catches up to you. Okay, so this is the ends means ethic. Okay, we've also got the golden rule. Okay. Now, of course, most religions have some variation of the golden rule. And it's basically do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, of course, different people's ethical values might differ. And just because I want something done to me in a certain way doesn't mean that everybody feels the exact same way. And it basically looks at there's this kind of one special standard for interpersonal relations. Okay? So let's give kind of a colloquial example. I had a colleague when I was in graduate school, and the guy was, late to everything, and it used to make people really angry. And when he would give lectures to his students, he'd usually be 15, 20 minutes late to his own lectures. And one of the students one time got real mad and said, "Well, how would you feel if we showed up late every time?" And he kind of laughed. He said, "Well, go ahead, because I'm going to be late anyhow." I mean, so, the treatment of, he didn't care, okay? His values didn't necessarily reflect the values of those around him, including his students. Okay? And again, you can apply this in business also. You have to remember, some industries have very different norms and standards. And just because they would prefer a certain practice or prefer a certain behavior doesn't mean that's going to be universally acceptable. Or you can look at things like ethical relativism. Well, in some countries, people appreciate being treated in one way or another. In other countries, that's considered unacceptable behavior. So the golden rule is somewhat ambiguous. Of course, we've also got, intuition ethic, okay? And the basic premise of this is, if you got a gut feeling that says something is right or wrong, probably that's true. Probably it is right or wrong based on what your gut tells you. Now, of course, you have to remember, intuition, that gut feeling, it's a pretty good source of information. It's a pretty good source of ethical behavior, but you're not always right. And sometimes you may think that just what's good for you may be ethical. Okay, your gut says do this because it's good for me, and you might mistake that for ethical behavior. And again, there's no way to really validate your gut feeling outside yourself. There's no way to check it off on a checklist or have a colleague validate it for you. And sometimes when there are multiple or conflicting or complex decisions to be made, your gut doesn't really have an answer then. Okay? So let me give an example. A lot of times, mistakes are made in business, and you say, well, why did you do that? And people say, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. When you hear that expression, it seemed like a good idea at the time, you know nothing good will come of it. Okay? My old job, we used to say, there were 4 words we never liked to hear an employee say. Okay? It was, hey, y'all, watch this. Okay? One good example of the intuition ethic that I came across, we had a individual. I don't know if any of you guys have ever seen like one of those giant metal presses. I can't even do it with my arms; it's so big. They're these giant cylinders made out of metal, and they're so heavy, and when they turn, it'll flatten out sheet metal. Okay, so they're very heavy, and it's a lot of pressure. Now, how do you actually clean one of these things when they start corroding? Well, what you're supposed to do is have a supervisor come in. They turn off the apparatus. They make sure it's disconnected from power. And then what you do is you get sandpaper, and every single inch of that thing until you get all the rust off. That's how you're supposed to do it. There were a couple of guys, they kind of wanted to take a shortcut. They thought they had a better way of doing it. What did they do? They took a giant piece of sandpaper, and they had one guy turn on the press, and the other guy lean back. And his idea was his weight leaning backwards would keep the sandpaper in place, and as the press would turn, it would clean itself kind of automatically. You have to remember, this is a large piece of apparatus, and that didn't happen at all. It wound up sucking him in. And fortunately, it didn't kill him, but his hand got in there, and it flattened it, and then he pulled out, and it took the whole thing off. And when there was the investigation of the workplace accident, they asked, what were you thinking? It seemed like a good idea at the time. Okay, so that's an example of the fallibility of the intuition ethic. At the same time, if you're doing something at work and you feel that it's wrong, probably you might be right. Okay. So we'll go ahead and stop here for the moment.